It was the fall of 2012 when my buddy Mike and I took a trip way out into the forests near the eastern edge of Oregon. We were both in our early 30s, working jobs that gave us too little peace and too much noise, and we figured we'd spend a long weekend in one of those rental cabins you can barely find on a map. One of those places that looks like it hasn't had a visitor in years. No cell service, no power lines, just tall pines, dirt roads, and quiet so thick you can feel it pressing against your ears. We had been planning the trip for a few months, picking a spot far enough off the grid that we wouldn't run into anyone else. I found this place listed on an old camping forum. Some guy had posted GPS coordinates years ago, claiming it was a forgotten little thing with a wood stove and 4 walls, if you don't mind mice. That was all we needed. We packed up the truck with enough food, gear, and whiskey to last 4 or 5 days and took off. The drive out took hours. Asphalt turned to gravel, gravel turned to dirt, and after a while even the dirt gave up and we were basically crawling along game trails. We had to stop a few times to move fallen limbs or knock rocks out of the way, but eventually, with the light fading, we rolled up on a clearing surrounded by a thick belt of pine and spruce. And there it was. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A single room made from old, graying logs, with a tin roof that looked like it might leak if you stared at it too hard. There was a small porch with a collapsed chair and a woodpile stacked under an overhang. No lock on the door. Inside, it was empty except for a wood stove in the corner, a rough-hewn table, and 2 old bunks with shredded foam pads. No windows, just slits in the walls that might have been used for shooting out of back in the day. We set up our camp right next to it, threw a tarp over the entrance to give ourselves a bit of cover, unloaded our gear, and cracked open the first bottle. The air smelled of pine needles, damp wood, and that cool mountain freshness you can't fake. The kind of smell that makes you feel far from everything in the best and worst way. The first night was peaceful. We built a small fire, grilled some hot dogs, and passed the bottle back and forth until the stars came out. It got cold fast. I remember sitting close to the flames and listening to the sounds of the forest, the crackle of wood, the occasional snap of a branch off in the dark, some distant owl. Normal wood stuff. We turned in around midnight, dragging our sleeping bags inside the cabin just to be safer from the cold. Mike fell asleep fast, snoring like a buzzsaw in the bunk across from me. I laid awake a little longer, eyes on the dark ceiling, ears straining through the silence. Felt peaceful, calm. That didn't last. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to the most god-awful sound I've ever heard in my life. It wasn't close at first, faint, but it was enough to yank me from sleep. It started like a woman screaming. That's what my brain told me first. A scream, long and high-pitched and full of pain. It cut through the stillness like a blade, echoing off the trees. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart in my throat. I've spent time in the woods before. I've heard coyotes, elk, owls, even the occasional bear huffing in the distance. But this was different. Too human, too raw. Mike stirred too. He didn't sit up, just groaned and muttered something, then pulled the bag tighter around his shoulders. Another scream followed, closer this time. Then a gap, silence, then again. It was moving, closer. I got up and tiptoed to the doorway, pulling the tarp back just enough to see out into the dark. The fire had burned down to embers, barely giving off light. I couldn't see anything, just black shapes of trees, swaying slightly in the wind. Then, from maybe 30 yards off, a sudden movement. A blur between the trunks. And again, that scream. This time it felt like it was right next to me. I backed away from the door, breathing shallow and fast. I wasn't armed. My shotgun was in the back seat of the truck, completely useless in that moment. I grabbed the hatchet from beside the woodpile and sat in the middle of the room, cross-legged, staring at the open door like something might walk in at any second. Mike finally sat up, eyes wide, whispering, "What the fuck was that?" I didn't have an answer. Neither of us slept much the rest of the night. I think we both dozed off in shifts, waking up at the smallest creak or rustle outside. Every little sound was suspect. When dawn finally pushed its way through the trees, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. My head was pounding from the tension and the half-empty bottle of whiskey we'd downed the night before. I stepped outside, took a long leak near the stump behind the cabin, and checked the fire pit. Nothing looked disturbed. No prints, no marks. Whatever had made that noise hadn't come closer. Or it had, and we'd just never seen it. Mike was walking circles around the cabin with his coffee mug, eyes still darting toward the trees. Then we heard the sound of an engine, faint like an old chainsaw sputtering to life. It got louder, closer. I saw the dust first, a faint trail rising above the brush down the trail we'd come in on. Then came the shape of a battered old pickup. Must have been from the 70s, dark green with rust on the panels. The kind of truck that shouldn't have made it down those roads. It rolled up slow and I froze. We were alone. No cell signal. No one knew we were out here, not for sure. We hadn't passed a single person on the way in. My shotgun was still locked in the truck, and this stranger, whoever he was armed. I could see the revolver on his hip as he stepped out of the truck. He was an older guy, maybe late 60s, early 70s. Long white beard, denim jacket, work boots caked with dust. His dog, some kind of shepherd mix, jumped down from the passenger side and sniffed the ground. The man walked toward us like it was the most normal thing in the world. I didn't say anything at first, just nodded. He nodded back, looked at the fire, looked at the cabin, then at us, smiled. That was when the fear started to loosen its grip a bit. His face was kind, not blank, not menacing, just a guy, curious, maybe bored, maybe just lonely. He stayed for a bit, sat on an overturned log. We gave him a beer. He offered us a smoke. We didn't talk much, just the basics. He said he lived a few miles west, off a spur road that hadn't been used in years. Said he liked to drive around in the mornings with his dog just to see who's stomping around. It was when we mentioned the scream that things shifted a little. I watched his face. He didn't laugh, didn't look surprised, just nodded real slow and looked off toward the trees like he was remembering something. He said something that stuck with me since. Well, he said, there's cougars out here, black bear too, coyotes now and then, but they won't bother you none. The only dangerous animals out here walk on two legs. Keep an eye out for them. That was it. Nothing dramatic. No warning. No ghost stories. Just that. And it gave me a chill. Not the kind from a cold breeze, but the kind that starts low in your back and works its way up like something's watching you even though you can't see it. I think it hit both of us the same way. Like someone had pulled a tarp off the truth we'd been ignoring. You can prep for nature. Bring the right gear, carry a weapon, know the terrain. But people, out in places like this, you never really know what you're dealing with. He stayed maybe 20 more minutes, petted his dog, asked a few more questions, then said he ought to get going. Wished us well, tipped his hat, and puttered off down the road like nothing had ever happened. Mike and I didn't say much for a while after he left. We both sat there watching the dust settle. After a bit, I finally went and loaded my shotgun. Kept it by my side from that point on, even while I was cooking or just sitting around. We stuck it out the rest of the weekend, but it wasn't the same. We still hiked a bit, fished in the stream nearby, and had some laughs. But the nights were tense. That scream came again on the third night. Farther off, but still there. Still that same awful sound. Like pain and rage wrapped together. We didn't see anything. Never caught a glimpse. I don't know what made that sound. Probably a cougar, like I've come to believe. Maybe in heat, maybe hunting. But it wasn't the animal that kept me on edge. It was the idea that someone else might have heard it too. Someone who didn't roll up with a smile and a dog. Someone who didn't want to talk. Just watch. We left on Monday morning. Packed up quick. Cleaned the cabin. Buried our fire pit ashes. Left everything as we found it. The ride out was quiet. It's been years since that trip. I've gone camping since. Gone deeper, farther, wilder. But I always remember that weekend. That scream in the night. That old man in the truck. And especially what he said. The only dangerous animals out here walk on two legs. He was right, and I haven't forgotten it since. About 8 years ago, when I was in my early 30s, I took some time off work to do something I'd always dreamed about: driving across the United States. I started in upstate New York, loaded my car with gear, maps, a beat-up cooler full of food, and a weathered tent I'd used 100 times in the forests of northern Ontario. My plan was simple: head down the east coast, cut west somewhere around Georgia, then drift through the southern states until I hit California. No tight schedule, no must-see stops. Just me, the open road, and the occasional side trip into nature. I'd spent most of my camping life in boreal forests. Wet, green places full of thick pine, black flies, and muddy boots. I was confident in the woods. I knew how to hang a bear bag, how to make fire in the rain, and how to sleep through coyotes howling in the dark. But I'd never camped in a desert, and I hadn't really thought about how different it could be. About 3 weeks into the trip, after cutting through Texas and northern Arizona, I landed in Utah. It was early October. Days were warm, nights were crisp, and the skies were mostly empty of clouds. I hadn't originally planned to stop at Bryce Canyon, but I was nearby, and I'd heard from a guy at a gas station that it was worth the detour. He wasn't wrong. The place looked like another planet. Orange and red hoodoos rising out of the canyon floor like stone trees frozen in time. I checked in at the park entrance and asked about trails. I wasn't looking for a full overnight backcountry trip, just a long hike and maybe one night camped in the canyon. The ranger pointed out a loop that took me down into the formations and said it was dry, simple terrain. I figured I'd hike in early, explore for the day, sleep one night down low, and climb out first thing the next morning. I was confident, overconfident if I'm honest. The hike down was surreal. The path zigzagged into the canyon like a loose thread pulled through a sweater. The air was dry, the ground dusty and packed. Crumbled a little under my boots, but nothing I couldn't handle. I passed just a few other people during the descent, most of them already heading out. I made it to the bottom early in the afternoon and set up camp in a small clearing tucked near some low rocks. I didn't see any streams or creeks, but that didn't surprise me. This wasn't the kind of place where water just ran freely. The sun moved fast across the sky, and by late afternoon, the shadows were long and the temperature was already dropping. I ate a cold meal, some crackers, dried sausage, and an apple, and leaned back against my pack to watch the canyon glow orange as the sun dipped behind the rim. It was peaceful, and for a while, I thought this would be one of those quiet, perfect memories I'd carry with me for years. It still is, but not for the reasons I expected. Just after sunset, the wind shifted. It was subtle at first, a breeze that didn't match the dry warmth of the day. Then I noticed the sky darkening in the wrong direction. The east, which should have been catching the last glow of twilight, was filling with clouds. Low, thick clouds that didn't belong to this kind of place. It was hard to judge distance or speed down in the canyon, but I had a bad feeling. I could smell the rain before I saw it. A strange, dry earth scent, like hot stones being doused. I was already lying in my sleeping bag when I heard the first drops hit my tent. Soft, scattered, hesitant. I sat up fast. The tent wasn't built for real storms, just enough to keep the dew off. Within 5 minutes, the light drizzle turned into a steady pour. It wasn't deafening, but it was persistent, and it started to run along the floor of the canyon. At first, it just puddled in small dips and ruts. But then I noticed it starting to move, thin streams cutting through the dust, joining, widening. I stepped outside with my headlamp and watched as water began creeping past my boots like it was alive. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a little rain. The entire canyon was a funnel, and I was standing in the drain. I packed my gear in a panic. No folding, no organizing, just stuffing things into my backpack, rolling my sleeping bag as fast as I could while my fingers got clumsy from adrenaline. The slope up from my camp was steep and slick with mud already. I didn't stop to second guess. I started climbing, using hands and boots, slipping every third step, grabbing at rocks that crumbled in my grip. Behind me, the trickle had become a small stream. 10 minutes later, when I looked back, the entire canyon floor was covered in moving water. A full-blown river was forming, brown, churning, fast. The climb was brutal. I had to stop twice just to catch my breath. lungs burning in the cold, wet air. I felt my thighs shaking, boots skidding on the softening trail. I knew I didn't have long before that water caught up to me. I didn't even want to think about what would happen if it did. I didn't know how deep it could get. I didn't know if there were boulders that could crush me or undercuts that could trap me. I just knew I had to keep going. By the time I made it to the rim, the rain was pounding down like it had been waiting all year for this one night. I stumbled into a small picnic shelter near the trailhead and just collapsed there, soaked, heart still racing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the cold concrete floor, wrapped in my wet sleeping bag, staring out into the black, listening to the storm rage below me. When I finally went back down the next morning, the path was destroyed. Not gone, but gouged out, ripped up. My camp was under almost a foot of water, and debris, branches, stones, someone's lost water bottle, was scattered everywhere. If I'd waited even 2 more minutes before climbing out, I don't think I'd have made it. That slope had turned into something close to a waterfall. That should have been enough excitement for one trip, but I wasn't done yet. 2 weeks later, I was back in the Northeast, heading home slowly through rural Maine. I'd stopped near Baxter State Park for a few final days of camping before the weather turned colder. The forests there reminded me of home. Tall pines, the smell of damp leaves, and the occasional black bear. I'd seen a few in Ontario before, always from a safe distance. They weren't grizzlies, but I respected them all the same. I parked at a trailhead a few miles from the main campgrounds. It was late in the season, so most of the spots were empty. I hiked in a few kilometers and set up near a clearing, close to a creek. It was a quiet, calm evening. The air had that sharpness to it that you only get in fall, just a hint of frost hiding in the wind. The trail back out was narrow, hemmed in by brush and young trees. The next morning, after a long, dreamless sleep, I set out for a short hike. I brought a day pack with water and a few snacks, keeping my knife clipped to the strap like I always did. I wasn't planning on going far, just a loop that would take me across the ridge and back down. About an hour into the hike, I rounded a bend and froze. Right there in the middle of the trail, maybe 6 or 7 feet ahead, were 2 bear cubs. They were small, maybe the size of border collies, covered in thick black fur that looked too fluffy to be real. One of them glanced at me, then kept walking like I didn't exist. The other stopped, sniffed the air, then followed its sibling into the bush on the far side of the trail. I didn't see the mother. That was the worst part. I knew she had to be close, and I knew enough about black bears to understand that getting between a sow and her cubs was probably the fastest way to get torn up. I backed up slowly, heart pounding in my ears, eyes scanning the trees. Every branch crack sounded like a footstep. Every dark patch between trunks looked like a shadow moving. I didn't wait to see if she'd show up. I took a long, wide detour off the trail, cutting through the forest with my compass and map. It added almost an hour to the hike, and my nerves were shot by the time I got back to camp. But I didn't care. I was just glad to be alone. That night, I stayed in a small rental cabin near the park entrance. It was basic, no electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove and a hard bed with a wool blanket. I thought I'd sleep better indoors after everything, but I didn't. Something about that cabin felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The door creaked constantly, even when latched. The wind scraped the branches against the roof in ways that sounded too rhythmic. And at one point, late in the night, I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. Something big. I didn't check. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes wide in the dark, listening. Could have been a bear. Could have been nothing. But it reminded me of how small I was out there, how thin those walls were, how little separated me from the wild. I left early the next morning before sunrise. I drove straight through the day, stopping only for gas and coffee, until I crossed back into Canada. Looking back, those 2 weeks changed how I think about being alone in the outdoors. I still love camping. I still head into the woods whenever I can. But I'm more cautious now. I respect the desert in ways I didn't before. I don't trust the weather just because the sky looks clear. And I never, ever forget that nature doesn't care how prepared you think you are. Some lessons you only learn once. If you're lucky, you survive them. It was early April of 2021 when I decided to float a stretch of the Yampa River through a remote part of Dinosaur National Monument in Colorado. I was 34 at the time, in decent shape, and I'd been on plenty of solo river trips before. Not that I was reckless, just maybe a bit too confident for my own good. The weather looked decent, cool, but manageable. I had my gear dialed in, an in-reach device in case of emergency, and 5 days worth of food packed into my little inflatable pack raft. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway from the noise of regular life. I'd done the Yampa before, but never this early in the season. That was my first mistake. The river was low, running cold from spring melt, barely scraping past 2000 CFS. The forecast said mid-50s during the day, high 20s at night. I'd layered up wool base, dry suit, neoprene socks. I had a lightweight tarp and bivy setup, packed dry in my roll top. Everything looked good on paper. I shoved off from Deer Lodge Park just after sunrise. The water was glassy, quiet except for the occasional bird overhead and the soft lap of current on my hull. It was perfect, exactly what I'd come out here for. For the first day and a half, things went as planned. I passed the familiar cliffs and cottonwood groves, drifted beneath tall canyon walls where the sunlight only touched the edges. Camped the first night on a sandbar near Harding Hole, warmed my hands over a jet boil, and slept like a rock under a sky of stars that looked close enough to touch. By late morning on day 2, I was somewhere below Cleopatra's Chair, not far from the Little Yampa. It wasn't a big rapid, barely even a riffle in most conditions. Just some minor standing waves and a few rocks to thread through. I'd paddled much worse in the past, sometimes with a beer in hand and one eye on a fishing rod. But this time, I don't know exactly what happened. I must have hit the angle wrong. I leaned forward to avoid a branch, tried to correct my line, and suddenly, just like that, I was upside down. It wasn't dramatic, not a full flip with gear everywhere, more like a slow, dumb roll to one side. My body was submerged instantly, and even though the dry suit kept me relatively dry, the cold shocked me. I went under just long enough to lose orientation. When I popped up, I grabbed the boat with one hand and my paddle with the other. I kicked to stay afloat in the slow-moving current. The water was deeper than it looked, maybe shoulder height, but too deep to stand and too shallow to swim efficiently. I could feel the gravel bottom with my toes, but I had no leverage. I tried to get back into the boat, but my paddle had wedged itself between two rocks. I pulled hard, and that's when it happened. I felt a pop in my shoulder. At first, I thought I'd torn a muscle, but then I couldn't lift my arm. My left shoulder had dislocated. Pain radiated across my chest and up into my neck. My fingers went numb, and the paddle floated away behind me. Now I was really in trouble. I clung to the boat with my right arm and kicked toward the far shore. It took maybe 10 minutes to make it, but it felt like an hour. When I finally dragged myself onto the muddy bank, I collapsed on my knees, soaked to the bone and shaking. My left arm dangled uselessly at my side, and somewhere along the way I'd bashed my head. I didn't even notice at first, but when I wiped the water from my face, my hand came away red. I sat there, stunned, trying to take inventory of what just happened. I didn't have a mirror, but I could feel the swelling on my forehead and the warm trickle of blood. The gash wasn't deep, but it was bleeding steady. I was miles from anyone with no way to paddle, and the cold was already creeping in under my suit. The thing about cold is that it doesn't hit all at once. It starts in your hands, your feet. The fine motor control goes first. I tried to unzip my PFD but couldn't grip the tab. My fingers were stiff, pale. I knew I needed to get dry, get warm and fast. My dry bags were still strapped to the raft, thank God. I managed to drag the boat up the bank, teeth chattering so hard I could barely keep them together. I found a patch of flat gravel about 50 feet from the water and dropped to my knees. Tried to unroll the tarp. My hands wouldn't work. The knots on the paracord were impossible. I ended up using my teeth. I got the tarp sloppily staked out and wedged myself under it. I had an emergency blanket, one of those foil ones. I ripped the packet open with my mouth, but it was slippery, thin, nearly impossible to unfold. My left arm still wouldn't move, and the pain in my shoulder pulsed with every heartbeat. I tried to start a fire next. Took me 5 minutes just to open the waterproof match case. My fingers were dead sticks, flopping uselessly. I struck one match and dropped it. Tried again. The third one lit, and I barely managed to touch it to some dryer lint I kept in a baggie. It flared for a second and died. I tried again and again. Nothing caught. The wood nearby was damp, and my body was shivering so hard now that I couldn't hold the match steady. I gave up after I spilled the matches into the dirt. Couldn't even pick them up. I crawled back under the tarp, shaking uncontrollably, wrapped in the thin emergency blanket that did almost nothing. I looked at my watch. It was 2:17 p.m. Still plenty of daylight, but no boats, no sounds. Just wind in the canyon and the muffled thud of blood pounding in my ears. That's when I pulled out the InReach. I didn't want to, felt like failure, but I knew I was past the point of managing this on my own. I clicked the SOS button. The screen confirmed the message was sent, and I waited. I kept the device in my chest pocket to preserve the battery. I curled in on myself like a dying animal and tried to think of warm things. Fireplaces, coffee. My dog curled on the couch back home in Boulder. The shivering slowed. I thought that was a good sign at first, but then I remembered shivering stops when you're past the edge, when your body gives up trying. I was conscious, but barely. Everything slowed. I couldn't feel my hands or feet at all. My vision tunneled. I knew I was bleeding from the head, but I couldn't feel that either. I was slipping. I don't remember hearing the chopper. I don't even remember them landing. 1 second I was cold and alone under a tarp, and the next someone was lifting me onto a stretcher. I couldn't talk. I remember the sound of Velcro and the warmth of a thick wool blanket. A voice said something into my ear, but I couldn't process the words. It was all muffled, like underwater. I woke up in a hospital in Vernal, Utah. 3 days later, they told me I was hypothermic when they found me. My core temperature had dropped below 90 degrees Fahrenheit. My shoulder was still dislocated when they got to me, had to be relocated under sedation. The head injury turned out to be a hairline fracture in my skull. Nothing surgical, but enough to give me a hell of a concussion. I stayed in the hospital for 5 days total. 2 of those days I barely remember. They let me see my gear once the Rangers brought it in. My dry suit was caked in mud. The InReach still clipped to the front. The raft had a few scrapes, but it had stayed inflated. My paddle had been recovered downstream, wedged under a fallen cottonwood. I was lucky. That's what everyone kept saying. But luck had nothing to do with it. I'd made stupid decisions. Going solo that early in the season. Underestimating the cold. Thinking I was too experienced to get into real trouble. All it took was one slip-up. A freak dislocation, a bad fall, and everything spiraled. I don't boat solo anymore. Not on big water. Not even on easy runs. It's just not worth the risk. The thing that sticks with me most isn't the pain or even the fear. It's the helplessness. That moment under the tarp, soaked and bleeding, when my hands wouldn't work. When I knew I couldn't save myself. That still lives in the back of my head. I still pack the same InReach. Still carry fire-starting gear, only now I keep 3 separate ignition methods and always test them with cold hands. I added a personal locator strobe and a redundant GPS. I've changed a lot. The canyon is beautiful, but it doesn't care about you. The river doesn't care how much you've paddled or how confident you feel. It moves, it cuts, it claims. That trip should have been effortless. It was supposed to be a break, not a brush with death. But I got out, and I learned, and I made it home. That's enough. It was the summer of 1983, and we were spending yet another family trip in the mountains of Colorado. For some reason, despite growing up in Wyoming where the landscape was no less majestic, our family's go-to camping trips were always in Colorado. Maybe it was because my dad had a thing for the rugged peaks and pine forests, or maybe it was because Colorado's mountains seemed more expansive than Wyoming's. Either way, I had come to associate the cool, crisp air of the Rockies with summer memories. I was 12 at the time, and my brother, Alex, was only 8. I always thought of myself as the more responsible one, the older sibling who had to look after him, even if he could be a little pest when we were out there. That particular morning, or perhaps it was the middle of the night. Honestly, it was so dark and cold that I couldn't really tell. I woke up from a restless sleep in the old canvas tent. The edges of the tent were cold, and my sleeping bag, thin as it was, didn't help much. The fire had long died down, and now it was just the deep, heavy silence of the forest and the freezing air creeping in. The chill went right through the fabric, so I decided I'd had enough. I was going to the car. The warmth of the old 1976 Ford Country Squire sounded like heaven right then. I rolled over and tried to move quietly, but in doing so, I knocked into Alex, who was sleeping soundly beside me. Of course, he woke up instantly, grumbling like he always did when I moved. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "I'm freezing. I'm going to the car," I whispered, struggling to get my feet out of the sleeping bag. "Me too," he said groggily. "Shut up, you're not going anywhere. Go back to sleep," I said, annoyed, but of course he didn't. He followed me as he always did. I unzipped the tent and crawled out, feeling the cold air hit me like a slap. The morning was still dark, but I could already see the first hints of light creeping over the ridge of the mountain to the east. That faint glow made me second-guess my idea of staying up. The car didn't seem as appealing anymore. The sun was coming up after all. "I'm staying up," I said, thinking the sunlight would warm the cold that had settled in my bones. Alex, still behind me and still sleepy, squinted at the horizon. "The sun don't rise over there," he muttered, a little annoyed I'd even said that. I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, it does. Just look. It's coming up over there." The glow was strange. It was red, not the soft yellow of dawn. It looked different, and as I stared, it was starting to grow brighter. I wasn't sure what it was, but it made my stomach twist uncomfortably. Alex, being the little pest he was, stared at me. "No way," he said, pointing up the slope. "It's a fire. That's a fire." I shrugged him off. "No way, it's just the sun. Maybe there's a fire somewhere way off, but it's nothing to worry about." But as I stared harder, something in my gut told me he might be right. The glow didn't look natural, not like sunrise. It had an unnatural, ominous red to it, and I felt a sudden rush of unease. It was getting brighter, the light turning from a dull red to something deeper, something alarming. That's when I heard the rustling. My dad's voice, gruff with sleep, called from inside the tent. "What are you two doing out there? Get back inside." But when he stepped out of the tent, rubbing his eyes, he stopped mid-motion. The moment his eyes locked on the glow, he froze, his hand still on the tent flap. I saw his face go pale in the dim light, and I knew something was wrong. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. He turned sharply toward the truck. "We're leaving. Pack up." "What's going on?" My mom's voice, now awake, joined the chorus of confusion. "We don't have time to explain," he said, already on his way to the truck. "Grab everything. Now." My heart started to pound in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad was usually calm, no matter the situation. But now his voice had a sharp edge to it. He didn't waste time. We scrambled, throwing things into the back of the old station wagon as fast as we could. Sleeping bags, the tent, our clothes, everything. None of it was carefully packed. It was all jammed in as if time itself was against us. The whole campsite was eerily quiet, but I could feel the tension building, the kind that makes the air thick and hard to breathe. The fire, which I had originally dismissed as nothing, was now burning hot in the sky. I could smell it even from where we were parked. It smelled like something was burning far too close. We couldn't see much beyond the tree line, but that red glow was spreading rapidly, flickering in the distance like a warning. My dad slammed the trunk closed and jumped into the front seat. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he put the car into gear. I had never seen him so rattled. "You okay?" my mom asked, looking at him with wide eyes. "Just drive," he said shortly. The roads in the mountains weren't the easiest to navigate. Narrow, winding gravel paths were the norm, and the lack of guardrails meant you had a straight drop into oblivion if you veered off course. As Dad sped down the trail, I could feel my stomach drop every time the tires hit a loose rock or the car bounced over a rut. The whole time, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, terrified of what was behind us. The smoke was thickening in the air, and the world around us was slowly turning into a smothering haze. "I don't like this," Alex said from the back seat, his voice cracking. I could hear the fear in it, and I couldn't help but agree. This was real. This wasn't some camping mishap. This was something we weren't prepared for. As we rounded a tight curve, we saw the flashing lights of a truck coming from one of the side roads. A game warden's truck, a large, rugged vehicle, bounced towards us. My dad slowed down, rolling down the window as the game warden pulled up alongside us. The warden's face was grim, a mix of concern and urgency. He told us the fire was spreading fast, and that we had time to get out, but not much. His words did nothing to ease the tension in my chest. He reassured Dad that we had the upper hand, that we were out of the worst of it, but the urgency in his eyes said otherwise. I didn't feel relieved, not at all. "We'll be fine," my dad said, more to himself than anyone else as we rolled away from the warden, but my heart was still pounding. Every turn seemed like it could be the last. The smoke was heavier now, swirling around us, and the air smelled like burning wood. It wasn't long before it became difficult to see clearly. As we kept driving, I kept my eyes forward, but my mind was spinning. I didn't know how much further we had to go, but the thought of being trapped in those mountains with that fire chasing us was something I didn't want to think about. My dad's reassuring words, "We're ahead of the fire," were cold comfort when I could see how much the sky was darkening with smoke. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the highway. The open road was a welcome sight, and as we turned onto it, I could see the last remnants of the smoke hanging in the air behind us. The fire was still burning, but it was behind us now. I could breathe again. We didn't stop until we were home. Once we got there, the tension finally left my body, but the memory of that red glow, that fire spreading faster than we could drive, never really faded. Every time I hear about wildfires in the West or in Canada, a small part of me tightens up, remembering that night. The smoke, the fear, the uncertainty. It's a feeling I don't ever want to experience again. I don't think any of us ever really understood how close we came to being caught in that fire. We were lucky, but as I sit here now, years later, I can't shake the thought of it. I don't go camping anymore, not like we used to, and when I do go into the mountains, I can't help but look at the trees a little differently, the smoke a little more carefully. It's just one of those memories that sticks with you, and no matter how many times I try to forget, a tiny spot at the back of my brain always remembers the fire, the red glow in the sky, and the feeling of being just one wrong turn away from disaster. It was spring, 1994, and I was looking forward to a weekend camping trip with a small group of friends. We had been planning this for weeks, an escape from the usual grind of work, city life, and responsibilities. The site we had chosen was out of the way, in the dense woods of northern Georgia, in a secluded area near a town called Suches. It wasn't far, but it felt like we were a world away. The place was primitive, no running water, no electricity, no real amenities, but that was the appeal. Just a few miles of hiking and we were in the thick of it, surrounded by towering trees, the sounds of wildlife, and nothing but nature for miles. I arrived a little ahead of everyone else. I was excited, full of energy, eager to set up my gear and help get the fire going. The sun was still up, but the air had a crispness to it. Spring was still in full swing, but you could feel the coming warmth of summer. As I rounded the corner of the trail, I could already see the familiar sight of our friends' tents set up. Kate and Ted were already there, two of my closest friends. We'd known each other since college, and our camping trips had become a kind of tradition over the years. As I made my way into the campsite, my good mood quickly faltered. Something wasn't right. It wasn't obvious at first, but it was the way Kate was looking at me, her eyes wide, darting nervously in the direction of something just beyond my view. She didn't speak, but her body language said everything. Then, my eyes landed on Ted, standing near the tents, his posture tense. And next to him, a man. The stranger stood slightly apart, watching us with an unsettling stillness. I hadn't seen him before, and he definitely didn't look like he belonged. Ted was a big guy, solid, over 6 feet tall, built like a linebacker. But even he seemed out of his element as he stood near the strange man, who looked like he'd just stumbled out of a bad 90s crime thriller. He had long, unkempt hair, a thick beard, and clothes that looked like they'd been through years of wear. The stranger's face was pale, and his eyes were sunken, as though he hadn't had a decent night's sleep in a while. He just stood there, staring at us, like he was waiting for something. Kate, sensing I was about to ask what was going on, quickly whispered, "This guy won't leave us alone." Her voice was low, but there was a sharp edge to it. I looked back at Ted, who gave me a subtle shake of his head. It was clear that this wasn't a simple case of a friendly camper wanting to say hello. I glanced back at the stranger, who didn't seem to be in any hurry to move. Instead, he gave us a long look, almost too casual, like he was trying to figure out if he could join our campfire without us saying anything. I tried to process what was happening, but nothing about this situation felt right. It was the kind of thing that happens when you've been out in the woods too long. Things start to get strange, and your mind starts to question everything. We were in the middle of nowhere, and this guy was alone. He didn't seem to have a campsite of his own. No tents or gear visible anywhere nearby. The logical explanation was that he was just a lonely guy in the woods, maybe a little offbeat but harmless. But there was something about him that set my instincts on edge. We all tried to keep things light. I helped unload my gear, and we started setting up the camp. But the stranger didn't leave. It felt like he was trying to insert himself into everything we did. Every time we tried to get our dinner going, there he was, walking over with his cooler. He had this odd grin on his face, as though he was pleased to see us, but it was unsettling, like he wasn't quite aware of the boundaries of social interactions. When he opened his cooler, I'll never forget what I saw. A steak floating in murky water, alongside a couple of beers. That was all. No sides, no vegetables, just a piece of meat and a couple of cans. My friends were equally confused, exchanging glances like, "What the hell is going on?" By this time, 2 other friends, Dave and Jenny, had arrived, and we all stood around the camp, trying to figure out what to do. It wasn't that the guy was being outright rude or aggressive. It was just that he was off. The way he talked, his mannerisms, everything about him made us uneasy. We were all about having a good time, but we didn't want to feel like we had to keep an eye on this guy every second. Ted, being the most level-headed of us, suggested we take action. He was big and could hold his own in a confrontation, so he was the obvious choice to approach the stranger. He was calm but firm when he asked the guy if he could respect our space, that we were hoping for a peaceful camping trip and just wanted to hang out alone. To our surprise, the guy nodded, muttered something incomprehensible, and then seemed to retreat back toward his own camp. It was awkward, but we all felt a little relieved. At least he wasn't going to linger around our campfire for the night. The evening passed uneventfully, and by dusk, we were all gathered around the fire. The warmth of the flames was a relief after a long day of hiking and setting up, and we settled in, cracking open beers, cooking up some chili, and laughing about past trips. But that feeling of unease lingered. It wasn't gone, just tucked away in the back of our minds. And then, out of nowhere, he appeared again. There was no sound of him approaching. One minute, we were laughing around the fire, and the next, he was there, sitting directly in front of us like he'd emerged from the woods itself. He sat down cross-legged, his knees pulled up to his chest. The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that made his features look even more unsettling. Then, he did something that made my stomach drop. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a handgun, a huge Desert Eagle. He held it loosely in one hand, the barrel pointed down toward the ground, but his finger was resting on the trigger. We all froze, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the air. I think we were all trying to process it, to understand if this was real, if this was actually happening. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. My eyes were locked on the gun, my heart pounding. He wasn't being aggressive. but there was something terrifying about how casually he handled it. He didn't say anything at first, just looked around at each of us, his eyes slowly moving from one person to the next. The tension in the air was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke in that same eerie, detached voice. "Anyone want to check out my piece?" The words were soft, unbothered, like he was offering us a beer or a snack. No one said anything. We couldn't. We just stared at him. Finally, Dave broke the silence, his voice shaky. "Nope, no thanks." The guy didn't react, just casually lowered the gun and stood up. He didn't say another word, just walked off into the dark. We were all too stunned to say anything. I felt like I had been holding my breath for minutes. We didn't know where he went or what he was doing, but about 30 minutes later, we were snapped out of our stupor by a blaze of light in the distance. His campfire, if you could call it that, was roaring, flames reaching at least 7 feet into the air. It was insane. He was standing near it, dancing around it, his movements erratic and wild. At one point, we saw him dump something onto the fire. The flames shot up even higher, and I realized with a jolt that he was pouring gasoline onto it. I don't know how long it went on, half an hour, maybe longer, but it was one of the most intense and surreal things I've ever witnessed. We stayed frozen in place, watching him from a distance, our minds reeling, not knowing what the hell was going to happen next. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The fire died down. We couldn't see him anymore, just the dying glow of the embers in the distance. The woods went eerily quiet. No more strange movements, no more fire. It was like he'd vanished into the night. The next morning, when we woke up, we went to check on his camp. There was nothing there. Not a trace of him, except for a melted gas can sitting in the ashes of his fire. It was like he had never existed. We spent the rest of the trip with a low-level anxiety, but the stranger never returned. We had a great time, cooking, hiking, and relaxing, but the memory of what had happened never fully left us. We talked about it that night, and even weeks later, when we got back to the city, none of us could explain it. He didn't seem like a man out of his mind, but his actions were erratic, unpredictable. It was one of those experiences that doesn't make sense until it's over. And even then, it leaves you with more questions than answers. That weekend still sits with me. There was no closure, no sense of understanding. But one thing was clear. We were all a little more aware of the people we meet out there in the woods, especially the ones who don't seem to fit. And every time I go camping now, I can't help but wonder what could have happened if we had let that guy get any closer. It's funny how one experience can stick with you, lingering in your memory long after it's over. I had something happen to me a little over 10 years ago, and even now, I remember it like it was yesterday. I know some people think stories like mine are exaggerated or paranoid, but I swear to you, everything I'm about to tell you is real. It wasn't a bad dream or some wild fantasy. This was something that really happened. I was in my early 20s, fresh into a relationship with my now husband, Aaron. We'd only been dating for a couple of months at the time, and since neither of us had a ton of experience with camping, we thought it would be a fun way to spend our spring break. We weren't looking for anything wild, just a few nights in the woods, enjoying the fresh air, and getting away from everything. We were both in college, and the stress of school had gotten to us. We thought a trip to a state park would be the perfect way to relax and unwind. We packed up a small tent, a cooler full of snacks, and a couple of sleeping bags. The weather was still a bit cold, even though it was late March, so we figured we wouldn't have to deal with many people. We found a spot at the park, nestled along a lake with just a few scattered campsites nearby. The park was mostly empty, so we felt like we had the place to ourselves. Aaron and I were the type of people who didn't really know what we were doing when it came to camping. We forgot a few essential things like extra blankets and firewood, but we made do with what we had. After setting up our tent, we realized we were short on a few things we hadn't thought about before we left. We decided to head to the general store near the entrance of the park to pick up some supplies. When we got to the store, we noticed a white pickup truck parked out front. A few guys were standing near it, and I could already feel their eyes on me as I walked by. It wasn't subtle, and the way they stared made me uncomfortable. They didn't hold back, either. When I walked into the store, I heard them whistle and make crude comments. At first, I tried to ignore it. I wasn't one to make a scene, but it was hard not to notice the way they were leering at me. Aaron must have noticed too because he stayed close, his body tense, but he didn't say anything. We grabbed our things as quickly as we could and made our way out of the store. I could still feel the men's eyes on us as we walked back to the car. We were both relieved to finally leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was one of those things that you can't quite put your finger on, but it left an uneasy knot in my stomach. I remember Aaron trying to reassure me as we drove back to our campsite. He kept telling me not to worry, that it was just a couple of idiots making stupid comments. But something about the whole situation still didn't sit right with me. By the time we got back to the campsite, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. We set up our little campfire, had dinner, and spent a couple of hours just talking and enjoying the peace and quiet. We both agreed that we were glad to be away from the hustle and bustle of school, just soaking in the silence and the fresh air. It was getting late, and we were both pretty tired from the drive and the day's activities. We decided to call it a night, so we crawled into the tent and got settled. The sound of the fire crackling outside was soothing, and for a moment, I felt like everything was going to be okay. But then, just as we were starting to drift off to sleep, we heard something. At first, it was faint, just a low rumble, but it quickly grew louder. A large vehicle, an engine roaring through the still night air, was pulling up near our campsite. I could hear the crunch of gravel beneath the tires as the vehicle came to a stop. My heart skipped a beat, and I shot Aaron a glance in the darkness. He looked back at me, his face shadowed, but I could tell he was just as confused as I was. The vehicle was too close for comfort, and it didn't seem like they were stopping anywhere else. The park had plenty of open spaces. They could have gone to any other campsite. But no, they pulled up right next to ours. We stayed silent, not daring to make a sound. I couldn't bring myself to peek out of the tent, but I had a feeling it was the same guys from the store. What were the chances of someone else pulling up in the middle of nowhere at that hour? We decided it was best not to make any noise, and eventually the engine turned off. There were no more sounds of movement for a while. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't help but feel like something wasn't right. Aaron and I lay there, listening to the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze, but the tension was palpable. We were both wide awake, just lying in the dark. We figured we'd wait until morning to move. If they were just some campers passing through, we'd be fine. But if they were looking for trouble, well, we didn't want to stick around to find out. We made a mental note to get up early and move to the other side of the lake, where the only other campers were. They were further away, and we'd feel safer there. At some point, we both fell asleep, though it wasn't a restful one. My mind kept racing, the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. And then, sometime around 3 a.m., we were jolted awake by bright lights shining through the fabric of the tent. My heart hammered in my chest as I heard voices, drunk and rowdy, unmistakable laughter, and the sound of heavy footsteps nearby. They were right outside. Flashlights were sweeping across the area, casting eerie shadows that made everything feel distorted and foreign. I could hear them shouting, but I couldn't make out the words. The voices grew louder, closer. I felt Aaron tense beside me, his breath shallow. We didn't say anything, but I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. We had to get out of here, and fast. The flashlights finally moved away, and we both scrambled into action. There was no time to waste. I could hear the men stumbling around, their voices muffled now, but I didn't want to stick around to see what they'd do next. We rushed to pack up everything we could, tossing sleeping bags and camping gear into the car as quickly as we could. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the straps, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. When we started the car and looked over at the campsite next to ours, the white pickup truck was still there, parked near the fire. The men were sitting around it, laughing and talking loudly. I could see them clearly now, their figures outlined in the glow of the fire. It was definitely them, the same guys from the store. Aaron didn't hesitate. He slammed the car into drive, and we took off, leaving the campsite behind us. We didn't look back, but I kept hearing the sound of the truck's engine revving in the distance. I couldn't tell if they were following us, but I didn't care. We had to get out of there. We didn't stop until we were far enough from the park that I could breathe again. The adrenaline slowly started to wear off, and I felt my hands unclench from the steering wheel. I was exhausted both physically and mentally. My heart still pounded in my chest, and the nerves in my stomach hadn't quite settled. Aaron and I didn't say much on the drive home. We didn't need to. The fear was still fresh, and we both knew that we'd had a close call. It wasn't until a few years later, when we both got our concealed carry permits, that I really understood just how dangerous that night could have been. There are people out there who don't care about boundaries, who don't care about respect or decency. And in places like that, where you're far from help, that's when things can get really bad. I'm glad we didn't stick around to find out what those guys might have done. Maybe they were harmless, just a couple of drunk idiots looking for trouble. Or maybe they weren't. Either way, I'm not willing to take that chance again. Now, when we go camping, we carry. We've learned our lesson. We've also learned to trust our instincts. No matter how pretty the scenery or how quiet the night, there are things out there that can make everything go wrong in the blink of an eye. I don't know what would have happened if we'd stayed at that campsite. I don't know if they would have followed us or not, but I'm glad we left when we did. It's been 10 years, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. Some people might think I'm paranoid, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. And I'll never forget how close we came to being caught up in something we couldn't control. It was late June, 2012, and I decided to spend a long weekend camping out in a quiet corner of Monongahela National Forest in eastern Kentucky. I was 32 at the time, and this was something I'd done dozens of times before. Maybe not this exact spot, but I liked remote places, out where the trailheads weren't even marked and the Forest Service roads had more potholes than gravel. I wanted peace, solitude, just me, my gear, and whatever weather or wildlife I had to deal with. I'd driven in on a Thursday afternoon. There was a primitive old pavilion deep in the forest, a stone and wood structure likely built back in the 30s or 40s, back when the CC was putting up park shelters all over Appalachia. The roof was tin and creaky, but it kept the rain out, and the four corner posts held the structure off a big concrete slab. No walls, just open air on all four sides. That was where I set up my tent. It was the kind of setup I'd used before. The roof gave me shelter from the elements, and the slab meant I didn't have to worry about pooling water or mud if it rained. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner, beans, rice, and some jerky, and fell asleep early. The next day, I spent most of my time hiking. It was hot and humid, and the woods were thick with that green, late June growth. Everything was alive and buzzing, from the horseflies to the tree frogs. I made a big loop through the ridges, came across a couple of overgrown trails I didn't recognize, and made it back to my campsite by late afternoon. I was soaked with sweat, shoes full of grit, but I felt good. Around dusk, though, I noticed the air shift. The stillness that had hung in the forest all day started to break. First came the birds, they got quiet. Then the wind picked up. Not a breeze, but a sharp, fast-moving wind that came in strong gusts and didn't let up. The trees started hissing and swaying, branches snapping high above. I'd seen storms roll in before, so I wasn't concerned yet. But I checked the weather on my old handheld radio anyway. That's when I first heard the term derecho. I'd never encountered one before. I didn't even know what it was until the emergency weather broadcast explained it. A massive wall of fast-moving, long-lasting windstorms, sometimes hundreds of miles across, blowing through with hurricane-force winds. It was expected to hit the area by nightfall. I didn't have time to pack up and leave. Even if I did, the forest road was too narrow and winding, and the trees were already starting to creak. I made the decision to ride it out. The pavilion, while far from ideal, seemed like my safest bet. It was sturdier than any tent, and the concrete slab gave me protection from wet ground. I moved my gear into the center of the shelter, staked my tent down as tightly as I could, and weighted the corners with whatever I had: my cooler, my water jugs, some rocks from the nearby fire ring. As night fell, the wind came in full. It wasn't rain at first, just wind, fast, angry, and loud. The trees around me bent at angles I didn't think were possible. I could hear them cracking, groaning, and eventually breaking. Every few minutes, something huge would come crashing down in the woods with a deep, echoing thud. The sound wasn't just noise, it was physical. You could feel it in your chest. Inside the pavilion, I zipped myself into my tent, put on all my layers, and laid down. There wasn't much else to do. My headlamp flickered against the walls of the tent, shadows jumping every time the tin roof groaned overhead. I lay still and tried to breathe through it. I knew the wind wouldn't last forever, but I also knew it could do serious damage in a very short time. All I could do was wait. Then, sometime past midnight, maybe closer to 1 a.m., I heard it. It was faint at first, just a scuff. Then the sound of claws on concrete. A distinct tapping. Slow, uneven footsteps.
Top, Percy, top.
My first thought was raccoon, or maybe a porcupine, but the weight was wrong. It was too heavy. The taps weren't scurrying, they were methodical. Then I heard a sharp huff, deep and low, followed by another, louder this time. I froze. I didn't even need to peek out of the tent to know what it was. I'd dealt with bears before, mostly black bears, and I knew the sound of their breath when they were agitated. This one wasn't just sniffing around. It was pacing. The tapping got faster. I could hear it moving in circles, claws scraping and clicking on the concrete. Tap, 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 then a stop. A deep, low exhale. A sharp snort. Then more steps. It circled again, around and around my tent. I could hear the difference in the echoes, telling me it was moving closer, then further, then back again. My hands were sweating. My chest was tight. I tried to stay perfectly still, listening through the roar of the wind for any change in its movement. The bear wasn't just curious, it was stressed, just like I was. The storm must have driven it out of the woods. It had probably been sheltering under fallen trees or in a thicket, and when that failed, it came here, same as me, and now we were sharing the same small space. I knew better than to try to scare it. Normally, black bears are skittish. Yell, bang some pots, and they'll take off. But this one was already on edge, confused, probably running off instinct. I didn't want to make it feel threatened, so I stayed quiet. The bear circled again. I could hear its claws click, click, click across the slab, then pause, then click again. At one point, it came so close I could hear its breath against the nylon wall of my tent. Just one thin layer of fabric between me and 300 pounds of angry animal. I held my breath. My fingers were shaking. Then it growled. Not a roar, just a low, frustrated noise. A guttural sound deep in its chest. I think that was the worst moment. The sound vibrated through the ground. The wind was screaming all around us, but that sound, that growl, cut through it all. For the next half hour, the bear continued its pattern, circling, pausing, snorting. Sometimes it left the pavilion, only to return a minute later, claws clicking on the concrete. I imagined it out there, just beyond the tree-line, darting back and forth through the storm, trying to make sense of the chaos. The wind was getting worse. Trees crashing somewhere nearby, leaves and branches flying sideways through the night. I could hear debris smacking into the metal roof, each impact making me flinch. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to run. Where would I go? There was no structure stronger than the pavilion for miles, and if I left, I'd be completely exposed to the falling trees. My best option was to stay put, but staying meant sharing the slab of concrete with an unpredictable bear. At some point, maybe 2 hours into the ordeal, I realized I had to prepare for the worst. I couldn't use my gun. Even if I shot the bear, there was no guarantee it would die quickly, and if I missed or wounded it, I'd be in more danger than before. Plus, firing a gun inside a metal-roofed shelter in a storm sounded like a good way to go deaf or blind. So instead, I pulled out my hunting knife, a thick, 7-inch fixed blade. Then I took a roll of duct tape and taped it to my hand. That part sounds ridiculous, but it made sense at the time. My hands were shaking too much to trust myself to grip the handle if I needed it. So I wrapped it, handle to palm, until I was sure it wouldn't fall or be knocked out of my hand. I lay there, arms stiff, blade taped to my palm like some kind of deranged gladiator, just waiting. The bear kept pacing. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the sound started to fade. Not the wind that was still howling, but the bear. Its movements got slower, the circles wider. Then the claws stopped tapping. I didn't hear it leave. I just stopped hearing it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there for another hour, muscles aching, heart thudding, knife still taped to my hand, just in case. Dawn came slowly. First the sky turned gray, then blue. The storm began to ease. The wind still blew in short bursts, but it no longer sounded like the forest was being ripped apart. I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent. Everything was soaked. The pavilion was littered with leaves and bits of bark. A whole tree had fallen less than 20 feet away from the edge of the slab. My camp chair was gone. My water jug had rolled into the brush. But the bear was gone. No more claw taps, no more growls. Just empty space and the distant sound of broken trees swaying in the morning breeze. I cut the duct tape off my hand. My palm was red and raw where the glue had pulled at the skin. I packed up slowly. Every movement was stiff. I was sore all over, like I'd been in a car wreck. My legs barely worked right. I left the forest that morning. The road was almost impassable. Trees down everywhere, power lines snapped, limbs strewn like pickup sticks across the gravel. Took me hours to drive the 6 miles back to a paved road, clearing branches by hand just to get through. When I finally made it back to cell signal, I checked the news. The derecho had flattened hundreds of square miles, knocked out. A few years back, in the summer of 2016, I was working under contract with the British Columbia Wildfire Service, helping map post-burn zones and high-risk fire corridors using an infrared and LiDAR-equipped drone system. I'd done similar work before with other forestry programs across Alberta and Manitoba, but this one was different. We were dealing with one of the worst wildfire seasons the region had seen in over a decade. The air was dry, the fuel load was brutal, and the terrain was about as unforgiving as it gets. Steep, rocky, full of standing dead timber, and covered in thick underbrush that hadn't seen decent rain in months. At the time, I was 62, still recovering from cancer treatment that had taken a good chunk of my stamina and part of my left foot. I walked with a slight limp, but I could still move when I needed to. I was one of the few specialists with enough field experience to operate the drone system in rugged conditions, and more importantly, I knew how to do it safely. Or at least I thought I did. Most days involved being flown by helicopter into a high point above the active fire zone. We'd find a rocky outcrop or a safe ridge where the pilot could do a toe-in landing, basically touching one skid to the edge while the chopper hovered in place. I'd jump out, sometimes with only inches of space to land, grab my 70-pound equipment case, and then the pilot would lift off. Once I was alone, I'd unpack the drone, power it up, and start the mapping mission. The drone would scan the fire line with infrared and LiDAR to spot ash pits, hot zones, and fuel load concentrations. It was dangerous, but after the first few rotations, you start to settle into it. You get used to the sound of the rotor wash bouncing off cliff faces. You start trusting your gear. And maybe, in some quiet corner of your mind, you forget that you're standing one mistake away from death every time you step off that chopper. On the morning of the day I almost died, I woke up feeling off. I was staying in a temporary cabin near the fire camp, just a little plywood box tucked into the tree line with no insulation, barely enough room to stretch out. The coffee tasted like ash from the smoke in the air, and the wind had shifted overnight, pushing smoke into the base camp. My sinuses were already raw, and my throat felt like sandpaper. I didn't feel sick, just uneasy. The briefing came in just after sunrise. The fire had pushed hard overnight, gained almost 600 hectares, and the crews were pulling back to reestablish the containment line. My assignment was simple: fly in, map the northeastern flank, pull back, and wait for pickup. Same thing I'd done every day that week. But the terrain was getting tighter, the smoke thicker, and the fire was now climbing up the slope we were using for insertions. Still, the ops team decided to go ahead with the mission. The pilot, a young guy named Kyle, gave me a shrug when I mentioned the wind. "We'll be fine. was the only thing I got out of him that morning before we lifted off. We flew up through a column of smoke so thick the blades left turbulence trails in the haze. When we crested the ridge, I got a look at the drop point. It wasn't much, just a thin sliver of rock on a ridgeline barely wider than my boot. Maybe 2 feet across, with a sheer drop on both sides, 1,000 feet at least. There was no room to breathe, let alone move around. I didn't like it. I didn't say anything, but I felt it in my stomach, that gut-tightening squeeze that says, this is not the right call. Kyle brought the heli in slow, hovering just above the edge. I timed my jump, landed awkwardly, and skidded half a step before I found balance. The wind buffeted me hard, and I had to crouch to keep from toppling over. He dropped the gear case just behind me, and I lunged to grab it before it started sliding down the slope. One wrong move, and that would have been $55,000 worth of equipment, and my job gone. The heli pulled away and vanished back into the smoke. I was alone. I turned my back to the ridge edge, took a few breaths, and got to work. The drone launched cleanly, lifting into the hot, choppy air like a hawk. I sent it sweeping across the burn zone, watching live telemetry roll across my screen. The fire was chewing through entire stands of pine, moving fast. The data was valuable, too valuable to scrap. I worked fast, careful not to get distracted by the noise of cracking trees and the low roar of the advancing fire. The entire flight took just over 40 minutes. When the drone landed, I packed it back into its foam casing, latched the box, and radioed the ops channel for pickup. Nothing. I waited. I checked the gear. I listened. About 10 minutes later, I heard the chopper. Came close, then drifted away. Then came close again. Then nothing. Finally, the radio crackled. Too much smoke. They couldn't see the ridge. The alternate pickup zone was also socked in. I was told to make my way northeast, where fire activity was not as bad. That was all I got. I stood there for a second, holding the radio in one hand, staring at the smoke like it might part and reveal a miracle. But nothing changed. Just that angry, swirling orange-gray haze creeping closer and closer. That was the moment it hit me. I was 62 years old, half crippled, barely recovered from chemotherapy, standing on a razor-thin strip of rock in the middle of a wildfire with 70 pounds of gear strapped to my back. I actually said it out loud to no one. I'm too old for this shit. But there wasn't time to wallow. I had to move. I shouldered the pack. The straps dug into my collarbone immediately. The heat was getting worse, baking, suffocating. I couldn't see the sun anymore, just a blood-red glow above the smoke. Every breath tasted like burnt wood and melted plastic. My clothes were already soaked with sweat. I started walking. The slope down from the ridge was steep, unstable, and littered with loose rock and fire-damaged trees. The wind was swirling, sending embers in all directions. I slipped more than once and had to grab onto charred stumps or exposed roots to slow myself down. My left foot, what was left of it, ached with every step. The prosthetic was decent for level ground, but on that terrain it was murder. Within 20 minutes, the fire was all around me. Flames leapt from tree to tree with terrifying speed. I could hear the bark exploding from the heat, like gunshots echoing off the valley walls. Branches came crashing down randomly, often still on fire. One clipped my shoulder and seared a hole through my jacket. I stopped every couple hundred feet to roll in the dirt, what little there was, to smother the glowing embers that kept landing on me. I burned through my water bottle fast, not drinking, just dousing myself, trying to keep my clothes from catching. I was coughing constantly by then. My throat was raw, my chest tight. Every breath was an effort. At one point, a flaming log rolled downhill and nearly took my legs out. I jumped back just in time, lost my footing, and fell hard on my side. The case landed next to me, bounced once, and kept rolling. I scrambled down after it, my heart pounding harder than ever. I caught it just before it reached a ravine. That gear was my lifeline. Without it, I had no data, no proof of work, no way to justify even being out there. I kept going. For hours. That's how long it took me to get to the lower slope. Felt like a week. My body was shaking, probably from exhaustion, maybe shock. My hands were blistered from grabbing hot bark. My legs were bleeding where the brush tore through my pants. I was limping badly by then, dragging the gear case with one hand and steadying myself with the other. The fire had moved behind me now, but the smoke was still thick, and I could hear trees falling in the distance. And then movement, shadows in the smoke. For a second, I thought I was seeing things, but it was real. A crew of firefighters was coming up the trail, an engine team from Saskatchewan that had been posted to the lower sector. They spotted me and changed direction, one of them signaling for me to come toward them. I didn't have anything left. I dropped the case, dropped to my knees, and just pointed. They came running. They walked me down to a safe landing zone, a cleared patch near a logging road where the chopper could land. I barely remember the flight out. I remember slumping into the seat, buckling in, and then just going limp. I spent the next 2 days in a hospital outside Kamloops. Second-degree burns on my arms and neck. Dozens of smaller burns on my back and legs. Smoke inhalation that made breathing feel like sucking glass. The doctors told me I was lucky. If I'd stayed on the ridge another 30 minutes, I might not have made it. When I was discharged, I went back to the fire camp to collect my things. My drone case was still locked, still intact. The data was there, but I didn't care. I walked into the ops tent, told them I was done, and handed over my badge. I haven't mapped a fire since. That job nearly killed me, and while I got out, I gained something I didn't expect. A massive respect for the men and women who do that kind of work every day, who run toward the flames instead of away from them. They are absolutely out of their minds, but they are brave in a way I'll never be. I went back to consulting after that, paperwork, environmental assessment. Back in the fall of 2017, I was part of a backpacking trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia, somewhere in the Chattahoochee National Forest. I had signed up with a group run by a regional outdoor club. I was 31 at the time, moderately in shape, and had done a few overnight hikes before. Nothing intense, though. This trip was supposed to be a good challenge, but still manageable. A 5-day loop through remote mountain trails, peaks, and forest roads. We were a group of 9 total, including 2 guides. The second day had been long but beautiful. We had crossed streams, climbed steady switchbacks, and pitched our tents near a sheltered clearing just below a summit. No cell service, just a water filter, bear hangs, and shared snacks. It was the kind of trip that made your muscles sore in the good way, the kind that cleared your head. Until the 3rd day. We'd started that morning with light packs, no tents, just day gear. We were headed up a smaller peak called Wolf Ridge. There was another Wolf Peak in the area, which made things confusing, but our guide said this one was less traveled, which meant better views and fewer crowds. We made the summit around mid-morning, maybe 10:30 or 11. The trees had thinned, the sky opened, and we spread out across the rocks, snapping photos, peeling snacks from Ziploc bags, refilling water bottles from whatever was left in our bladders. The sun was out but filtered through a light overcast. I remember sitting with my back against a rock slab, chewing on a granola bar, feeling fine, maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. A little wind picked up, and I put my fleece back on. The temperature was already dipping slightly, maybe high 50s, but the weather in the mountains changes fast, so no one thought much of it. It was just afternoon when we started heading back down. That's when things went wrong for me. At first, I thought I was just lightheaded. I paused on the trail, letting the person behind me pass. I figured I'd stop for a second, take a sip of water, maybe eat something. But then the ground shifted, not like an earthquake, more like my sense of balance failed me. I blinked, tried to steady myself, and then I was down. I didn't fall hard, just sort of crumpled against the side of the trail, breathing fast. That's when the vertigo slammed me. It was like being on a carnival ride spinning out of control, only my body wasn't moving at all. I curled up, hands against my face, and the nausea hit me so suddenly I didn't even have time to react. I threw up violently, again and again, until there was nothing left in my stomach. Every time I moved my head, the world spun harder, and more bile came up. Someone in the group noticed. I could hear boots crunching gravel nearby, a few people crowding around. I couldn't open my eyes without everything tilting. My body was shaking, and I could feel the sweat under my layers even though the air was cool. The main guide, a guy named Travis, took over. He told the others to step back and gave me some space. He tried to get me upright, but I immediately collapsed again and threw up once more. After some discussion I could barely hear, they decided that the rest of the group would keep heading to the planned campsite for the night. It was still at least 5 miles away, and he'd stay with me. I don't know exactly what time that was, maybe 1:30 in the afternoon. Time started to slip for me. I was just trying to stay still, hoping the spinning would stop. But it didn't. I couldn't drink water without it coming right back up. My hands were getting cold now, and I knew what that meant. The guide radioed for help using a Garmin satellite device. It would still take time for anyone to reach us. We weren't on a major trail. This wasn't some tourist track in a national park. It was a side loop on a lesser-known ridgeline. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone arrived, a single EMT hiker, wearing a bright orange shell jacket. He dropped his pack and got to work, taking my vitals, asking questions I couldn't answer with more than a nod or groan. I could hear the edge in his voice. I couldn't keep anything down, and I was starting to shake worse. My teeth were chattering even though I was wrapped in layers. My body temperature was dropping. They got in 4 started, even though it took 2 tries because my veins were collapsing. That helped stabilize me a little, but it also made me colder. The EMT covered me in an emergency bivy sack and thermal blanket, but I was already going downhill. I couldn't sit up, couldn't walk, couldn't even crawl. It was going to get into the teens that night. The EMT and guide talked in hushed voices behind me. I couldn't see them. My eyes were still closed, but I could hear the stress in their tones. They decided they couldn't wait for a full-ground crew to hike in, not if it meant spending the night up there. So they called in a helicopter to be placed on standby. But the trees were too dense on the slope, and there was no open place to land nearby. The rescue crew had to hike in anyway with saws to cut a path for a stretcher. Meanwhile, the sun was setting. I could feel the cold creeping in through the rocks. Even wrapped up, even with someone sitting beside me to block the wind, I couldn't stop the shivering. I was weak, nauseous, and losing track of time. They gave me another 4, and I remember half-waking when my arms were adjusted and taped. Then nothing for a while. I think the rescue crew reached us around 9 p.m. I was semi-conscious by then, drifting in and out. I was barely aware when they loaded me onto the stretcher and strapped me down. They had to carry me down the same path we came up, only now it was pitch dark and colder by the minute. Every bump and dip in the trail sent jolts of nausea through me, but I couldn't vomit anymore. There was nothing left. After about an hour on foot, they finally reached the ATV that had managed to climb a side access road from a fire trail below. They loaded me on carefully, and then we started the ride down. It was rough, jarring, and loud, but at that point, I didn't care. I was just cold, bone cold. My fingers were numb, my jaw locked tight. The ATV got me to a waiting ambulance around 11 p.m. The crew warmed me up slowly, wrapped me in heated blankets, checked my blood pressure, and did a portable EKG. Everything looked weird but not alarming. Still, I wasn't talking or responding much. I could barely open my eyes. They took me to a small regional hospital about 30 minutes away, one of those places that's mostly empty at night and run by a skeleton staff. They wheeled me in and got a CT scan to check for anything neurological. They also ran a test to check for heart issues, maybe just to rule everything out. I just lay there, shaking, nauseous, disoriented, and alone. Both tests came back clean. That should have been good news, but what happened next was anything but. The nurse came in around 3 a.m. with discharge papers. I still couldn't walk. My legs wouldn't support me. I tried standing and collapsed right into the rail of the hospital bed. They said there wasn't anything more they could do for me, that I wasn't technically in a medical emergency anymore. They offered to call me a cab, but I had no phone service, no money on me, no ID, nothing. My gear and wallet were with the group, and they were still miles away, asleep in the woods. So there I was, 3 a.m., barely able to move, still sick and dehydrated, wearing the same wet clothes from the trail, in some forgotten back room of a hospital in rural Georgia. Alone. That's when one of the night nurses, this older woman with tired eyes and a southern accent, took pity on me. She whispered that she'd seen this happen before, people getting dumped out like they were just a file to close. She wheeled me quietly to an empty patient room in the back corner, turned the lights low, and brought me water and a pack of crackers. She even gave me a set of dry scrubs to change into, which took me a long time to manage. She didn't sign me back in. She just let me sleep there unofficially, curled up under the thin hospital blanket. She checked in once or twice through the night, but mostly left me alone. That simple act, giving me a warm place to crash, was the only kindness I had that night. By morning, my group had gotten word. The guides had checked the emergency network again and saw I'd been discharged. They hiked out fast, contacted the hospital, and showed up with my bag just after 8 a.m. I still couldn't hike out or move far, but they loaded me gently into a van and drove me back to a lodge they had reserved for the end of the trip. That night, I finally slept indoors again, on a soft mattress under heavy blankets, with a hot meal in my stomach. I was still weak for days. My balance took almost a full week to return. A few weeks later, I followed up with a doctor at home who said it might have been a sudden onset vestibular migraine or some inner ear inflammation. They couldn't say for sure. What I do know is this: things went bad fast. I went from eating trail mix on a mountain to barely able to speak or walk within an hour. And if it hadn't been for the guide, the EMT, the rescue crew with saws and a stretcher, and that one night nurse who defied her orders, I don't know how it would have ended. I think about that trip sometimes, especially in colder months. The thin air on the ridge, the sound of the chainsaw far off through the trees, the nausea that never quit, that slow, helpless descent into cold. But mostly, I remember lying under fluorescent lights, legs wrapped in hospital blankets. Every year, the Volunteer Search and Rescue Team I'm on holds an autumn training retreat up in the Cherokee National Forest. We run drills, polish our land NAV skills, refresh first aid certs, and most importantly, bond with the people we rely on when the real thing goes bad. We stay in a collection of old forestry cabins, rustic, off-grid places up in the mountains, reachable only by dirt service roads and hiking trails. No cell signal, no traffic, just woods and weather and each other. That fall, I was 36. I'd been on the team for almost 9 years. I wasn't the most senior member, but I'd worked a good number of recoveries by then. Missing kids, lost hikers, Alzheimer's patients, more bodies than I'd ever thought I'd see. I had my SAR dog with me, Brody, a part Aussie mix I'd raised since he was a pup. He was trained both in man-trailing and cadaver detection. Sharp dog, worked with a personality, vocal as hell, and had a strong bond with me. Never let me out of his sight if he could help it. We got up there on a Thursday afternoon. The cabins were the same ones we'd used for years. Old wooden frames, no insulation, with stoves for heat, and just enough bunks to cram 15 of us in. That year we had 12 members attend, plus 6 of our working dogs. We set up base camp near the largest cabin, stacked wood, sorted gear, and ran a short comms check. It had been raining off and on for days, and the ground was soaked. The woods smelled sharp, wet bark, churned leaves, distant fire smoke. A chill had started creeping in at night. It was the perfect setup for night drills. We usually ran 2 or 3 night training exercises during the weekend. One was already planned for Friday: simulate a missing hiker with a head injury. We'd split into groups, rotate who ran the dogs, practice litters, and land NAV under pressure. That night, I'd been paired with Jeff and Sarah. Jeff had served as a Marine officer, spent some time with recon. Sarah had worked paramedic rescue in Nashville for over a decade before moving out here. Solid team. We set out just before 2100. Our radios were dialed into the same channel, GPS units on and logging, and Brody was harnessed up and ready. We'd been given the general area the victim was staged in, but no specifics. Just a mile-wide swath of map to work with. We had headlamps, spare batteries, med kits, thermal blankets. Standard issue. We started slow, watching Brody work. He was on lead for the first quarter mile. The woods were wet and quiet. The kind of quiet where you hear water dripping from high branches and the soft slap of your own boots on leaves. No birds, no wind, just the wet quiet of the forest holding its breath. About 20 minutes in, Brody's behavior shifted. He stiffened, nose dropped lower, and he started pulling harder. He moved faster than I expected for a training scenario. Usually when we're tracking another team member hiding out for an exercise, the dogs act a little differently. Curious, alert, but not like this. This was serious work mode. Focused, determined, and I made the call to let him work it out. He veered left, away from the expected quadrant. We tried to radio base camp for a check-in, but the signal was garbage down in the low spots. Not unusual. We marked our path with GPS and kept following Brody deeper into the trees. After another 10 minutes, the terrain started to change. The soft rise of the forest floor dropped into a gully. Water pooled at the bottom. Maybe an old creek bed, maybe runoff from the rain. The mud was slick, greasy. I was about to call Brody back and reassess when my right boot hit a patch of wet clay, and everything went sideways. I slid. My feet went out. My hip slammed into a root. I tried to dig in with my hands, but the earth just came away in clumps. The slope turned steep fast. I scraped and bounced and slid until the gully abruptly dropped off. I felt it coming, the end of the slope, and then I was airborne for a second. Then impact. I landed hard. My back hit something, rock or stump. I don't know. A dull, horrible thud burst through my ribs, and all the air left my lungs in a sudden crush. My head hit next. Everything sparked white. The noise inside my skull roared. Then black. I don't know how long I was out. Could have been seconds. Could have been a minute or two. But when I came to, I couldn't breathe right. My sides screamed with every shallow breath. I was soaked in mud, rain, maybe blood. My vision was swimming. Brody wasn't with me. I did the only thing I could. I fumbled with the emergency SOS on my GPS unit. It was a handheld Garmin that sends a distress signal to base. We used it only if someone was lost or found or injured. I pressed it. The red LED blinked. Signal sent. Then I waited and waited. I listened for Brody, for Jeff or Sarah, but all I heard was water. The gurgle of a creek starting to run. Leaves shifting. My own wet breath. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps. These were too steady, too deliberate. Crunch, pause. Crunch. Getting closer. I couldn't move. I could barely lift my head. Every breath stabbed like glass between my ribs. I was concussed. I knew the signs, vision blur, nausea, the drifting feeling like my body wasn't mine. Then a man appeared. He wasn't part of our team. I knew every face, every build, every jacket. He was in jeans, an old canvas coat, soaked to the knees. He stood just at the edge of the gully, maybe 10 feet above where I lay half submerged in cold water and leaves. He just stood there, watching. He started talking, not to me, but like he was talking at me. His voice was soft, almost thoughtful, like he was pondering out loud. He started saying strange things about the creek, how people didn't realize how fast it could flood when a storm rolled in, how easy it was to get washed away, how hard it was to find bodies once the rain came, how the ground here, this specific area, was unstable, had been for years. It wasn't the words so much as the way he said them, like he was commenting on the weather or the price of gas. Calm, almost casual, but something in it felt deeply wrong. Like this wasn't a man surprised to find someone hurt in the woods. He wasn't panicked or rushing to help. He wasn't even curious. He was just observing. Then he started to move, slowly pacing the edge of the gully, looking for a way down. That's when the fear hit me hard. I realized I was completely helpless. I could barely move my arms, and breathing alone made me want to pass out. I had no way to defend myself. I didn't know if he was going to help, rob, or worse, but something in his voice made me sure. If he came down, it wasn't going to end well for me. Then I heard it, a familiar warblite trill from the woods above. Brody. My dog talked when he worked. Not barking exactly, he made these noises, chirps and half howls, little awooz that sounded like he was trying to hold a conversation. And what I heard then was his "I'm coming" slowpoke talk. his impatient, pushy, joyful noise when I lagged behind. He was close. The man at the edge stopped pacing, turned his head toward the sound. Then I saw Ranger. Ranger was a huge German shepherd that belonged to Tom, one of our senior handlers. Gentle dog, calm and steady. But what I saw then was a whole different animal. Hackles high, mouth open and curled back, teeth bared. His growl was low and constant. He came through the trees like a missile, eyes locked on the man. The man backed up a step. Then Brody appeared behind Ranger, mud-covered, tail flagged high, fur bristling. He joined in, barking high-pitched threat barks. Not play, not curiosity, pure warning. Then I saw movement behind the dogs. Tom came through the brush with Derek right behind him. Derek had done MMA fighting for years, built like a linebacker. Both men froze for a second when they saw the man, then moved straight toward me. The man didn't say anything. He just stared. The dogs didn't stop barking until he stepped back into the trees and disappeared. Tom and Derek stabilized me, checked my spine, patted my ribs, loaded me into the backboard. We radioed in the emergency and waited another 15 minutes for the wheelie to arrive. A wheeled frame we used to haul litters out over rough ground. Took another hour to get me back to camp. I remember parts of the ride, the jostle, the pain. Our camp medic cleared my neck but said I needed a hospital. One of the guys drove me out, slow, bumpy ride down the mountain roads. The hospital was small, rural. They confirmed the concussion and 2 cracked ribs. I spent the night under observation and got discharged the next morning. Back at camp, we talked about the man. Nobody recognized him. He wasn't a local hiker. No other teams were out there. We reported it as suspicious to the local sheriff's department. A deputy took notes. Nothing ever came of it, far as I know. But later, one of the nurses at the hospital asked where we'd been training. When I told her, she got this look, tight, careful, and said that area. I was 34 that summer, and it was the first week of September, late enough in the season that most of the crowds had gone, but still warm enough to hike without snowshoes. My husband Mark and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd both done a fair bit of backcountry camping before, but never this remote, never this exposed, and definitely never in a year like that one. We were aiming for the high country above Bridger Pass in western Wyoming, about 10 miles south of the Tetons. The whole area was dry that year, bone dry. Locals said it hadn't rained in over a month. Streams were vanishing off the map, and even the bigger ones were down to a trickle. The trail up to our first campsite followed a wide drainage that, according to our topo map, should have had water every mile or so. Didn't. We passed creek bed after creek bed, all cracked and bleached white. The silence was weird, too. No frogs, no mosquitoes, no birds chirping near water. Just wind. Mark was carrying most of our gear, which was typical. He always insisted on taking the heavier load. He was strong and stubborn that way, but this time, the sun was relentless. It must have been 90 degrees, and there wasn't any tree cover once we started climbing toward the pass. Around noon, I noticed he wasn't sweating anymore. His face was flushed, but his skin looked dry. He'd already emptied his last bottle, and I still had half a liter in mine. I gave him most of it, but it didn't help much. We kept checking the map. There was supposed to be a strong stream about a mile ahead. It was marked in blue and looked permanent. He said he was okay to push on, but I could tell he wasn't. His gait had gotten wobbly, and he kept blinking, like he couldn't focus his eyes. Finally, just below the crest of the pass, I made him sit down under a scrubby pine and left him with both packs. I took the bottles and my filter and headed up the trail. The stream was there, but barely. It had been reduced to a shallow trickle, maybe 4 inches wide. Still, it was cold and clear, and I was so relieved to hear the sound of water again. I crouched down and started pumping into our bottles. That's when I heard movement. It was soft, like twigs breaking under something padded. I glanced up and froze. On the other side of the little stream, maybe 20 feet away, a small brown head had popped up. Then another, and a third. 3 grizzly cubs, right there. Their fur was soaked and clumped, their ears alert. And behind them, just behind a cluster of young firs, I saw her, the mother. She was huge. Her coat was darker than the cubs, almost black, and her shoulder hump was unmistakable. She was staring at me, just holding still, ears forward, nose twitching. I was alone, completely alone. My brain blanked for half a second, then kicked in with every bit of bear safety I'd ever learned. I stood up slowly, never turning my back, and raised my arms. I spoke loudly. I clapped and made myself as big as I could. She didn't move. The cubs had dropped back into the brush, but she stayed put, watching. For a full minute, I didn't breathe. Finally, she turned her head to the side and eased backwards. It wasn't fast or scared. It was like she just decided I wasn't worth the trouble. She disappeared into the trees, and I didn't see her or the cubs again. I finished filtering the water with shaking hands, then made it back to Mark. He was pale but upright. He drank slowly and looked like himself again by the time we crested the pass. Neither of us said anything until we made camp near a rocky ledge just below the ridge. That was day one. The second night, we pitched our tent on a shelf near the canyon's edge. The views were incredible. Wide open meadows, ridgelines that glowed pink at dusk, and forests that stretched for miles. We were above the tree line now, fully exposed. There was no one else around. We hadn't seen another hiker in 2 days. That afternoon, we watched clouds gather on the western horizon. It was subtle at first, just a haziness, a faint gray blur along the mountains. But Mark was nervous. He's always had this instinct about storms, and he said we needed to make camp early and stay alert. By late evening, it hit. Not a normal storm, not even close. It started with wind, strong gusts that whipped through our guy lines and bent our poles. We checked the stakes, tightened everything, and got inside. Then the lightning started. I've camped in storms before. You see a flash, count the seconds, hear a boom. But this was different. The flashes weren't far off. They were right on top of us. Blinding sheets of light, some of them striking just beyond the ridge, maybe a quarter mile away. The thunder was like an explosion, immediate, not even a pause. The whole tent shook. The air reeked of ozone, sharp, almost metallic, and the ground buzzed. I could feel it through my palms when I braced against the floor. We knew we had to minimize contact with the ground. We crouched on our sleeping pads, feet together, arms wrapped around our knees. We weren't even lying down, just squatting there, in the dark, with strobe light bursts of white flickering every few seconds and the sky sounding like it was being ripped apart. At one point, the tent glowed white for what felt like a full second. No thunder, just light. I thought maybe we'd been hit. Then it started snowing. Not lightly dumping, wet, heavy flakes, huge and fast. Within 30 minutes, the ground was coated. Our tent sagged under the weight. We had to go outside twice to knock it off the fly. I couldn't believe it. It had been 90 degrees 2 days earlier, and now it was snowing so hard we couldn't see past our vestibule. Mark kept checking the fly zipper, watching the sky. "We need to be ready to move if this doesn't stop," he said. But where? There was no shelter. We were above 10,000 feet with no trees and nowhere to run. Eventually, the thunder faded. Still snowing, but quieter. I poked my head out around 3 a.m., and the world was completely transformed. The sky had cleared, the stars were out, and the whole canyon glowed in moonlight. For inches of snow blanketed everything. It looked fake, like some dreamscape. We didn't sleep much that night. The next day, we hiked through the snow melt in wet boots, descending into the canyon toward a lower basin. Everything was soaked. Our trail disappeared under slush and ice, and we had to navigate by GPS and dead reckoning for a few miles. We passed elk prints, bear scat, and fresh slide debris on a steep slope that hadn't been there the day before. Every ridge felt like it was watching us. That afternoon, it hailed. Marble-sized chunks. It only lasted 10 minutes, but it left welts on my arms and filled our bear canister with ice. We'd thought about making it to the lake basin that day, but the trail became a stream, and we had to stop early. That night, it dropped into the 20s. Our breath curled inside the tent. We slept in every layer we had. By the fourth day, the sun returned, but everything else had changed. Mark had blisters on both heels from wet socks. My thighs were cramping. We'd eaten through most of our food early, trying to stay warm, and now we had to ration. We were only halfway through our planned loop. We talked about bailing, about turning back, but that meant retracing our steps over the pass, where the snow was even worse. The safer route was forward, longer, but lower. We pushed on. That last full day was both the hardest and the most beautiful. The trail curved around a deep glacial valley, walls of granite on both sides, waterfalls streaming down polished rock faces. The air smelled like pine and wet stone. We saw a moose grazing in a distant meadow and kept our distance. That was the only large animal we saw that day. We reached the final basin just before sunset. The lake was glassy, still half-ringed with snow, and there was a rocky outcrop that offered some shelter. We set up camp and boiled the last of our food, instant rice and dried sausage. Tasted incredible. That night, the wind was calm. The stars were unreal, so many, it felt like the sky was crowded. We lay there, warm in dry clothes, watching meteors streak across the dark. No lightning, no snow, no bears, just silence and stars. The hike out the next morning was long but manageable. We descended through forest, following a stream that actually had water. I remember the relief I felt when we heard it. The real kind, fast and loud, echoing through trees. We refilled our bottles, soaked our hats, and just sat there for a while. When we reached the trailhead, my legs were shaking. Not from exhaustion exactly, more like adrenaline finally running out. We'd made it. We were scratched, sunburned, half frozen, and sore, but we were safe. That trip was the best one I've ever taken. It was also the scariest. Every day threw something new at us. Heat stroke, bears, lightning, snow, hail, even the threat of hypothermia. There were moments when I wasn't sure we'd make it, but we did. Not because we were fearless, because we were careful, lucky, stubborn. And when I think back on it now, even back in the summer of 2019, my husband and I planned a trip to a place neither of us had been before, Painted Lake in northern Utah, right along the state's high desert line. We had been married for almost 7 years by then, both in our early 30s, and camping had always been our favorite way to disconnect. No phones, no screens, just us, a couple of chairs, a fire, and whatever food we could cook over it. Painted Lake had been recommended to us by a friend who swore the sunsets were better than anything they'd ever seen. What really caught my eye, though, was that you could camp right on the water, with your tent or camper facing the lake itself, almost like your own private beach. We booked the site almost 3 months in advance. It was listed as Site 14, Lakeshore Primitive Access. That basically meant it was way off the main loop of campsites, tucked down a gravel road that veered off from the designated camp areas. It had no electrical hookups, no cell service, and sat about half a mile from the nearest neighboring site. At the time, that all sounded like a dream come true. Quiet, peaceful. No one stumbling through our camp at midnight on the way to the bathroom. That sort of thing. We arrived on a Friday morning in July. The drive out took us through miles of nothing. Flatlands, then canyons, then more flatlands again. The highway was cracked and dry, sun-scorched and empty. We'd fueled up in a town about 30 minutes from the turnoff, which was the last bit of civilization we saw before reaching the lake. No service stations, no gas, not even a convenience store past that point. The final stretch was 10 miles of a washboard dirt road. We felt every bump and rut in the ground as our SUV shook like a tin can. But when we finally reached the site, it was everything I'd imagined. Our campsite was right on the water, nothing but a narrow ribbon of sand between the fire ring and the lake. There was a ring of cottonwood trees behind us, but they were sparse and mostly there to offer shade in the afternoon. Otherwise, it was open and exposed. That first day was perfect. The sun was bright, but not oppressively hot, and the breeze off the water kept things cool. We set up the tent, unfolded the chairs, and started a small fire by dusk. One thing that always strikes me about camping that far out is the silence. When you live in the suburbs or even just close to a main road, you're used to constant low-level noise. Tires on pavement, airplanes overhead, the occasional siren. Out there, once the sun goes down, the quiet hits like a wave. It's not just quiet, it's absolute silence. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of the water unless you're sitting right next to it. It's peaceful, but after a certain hour, it starts to feel unnatural. Like your ears are straining to hear something, anything. We had eaten a simple dinner that night, beans and grilled sausage over the fire, and were just sitting by the flames, enjoying the way the last bits of light reflected off the lake. My husband had a small radio he sometimes used to catch weather reports, but even that was quiet, just static out here. After the sun dropped, we noticed how fast the temperature fell. It went from warm to chilly in a matter of minutes. I put on a sweatshirt and we both sat facing the water, the fire crackling behind us. Our headlights were off. The lantern was dimmed. There was no one else around. We hadn't seen a single other car since entering the recreation area. That's why it felt so strange when we suddenly saw headlights coming down the gravel road toward our site. It wasn't pitch black yet, but it was getting close. The shape of the vehicle was hard to make out at first, but once it came closer, we could tell it was a black SUV. Newer model, no markings, windows so tinted you couldn't even see the driver. It slowed just slightly as it approached our site, enough to roll over the cattle guard and make a crunching sound in the gravel. My husband stood up and waved, a casual gesture just in case they were lost and needed help. But they didn't slow down for us. They didn't even acknowledge us. They kept driving forward, rolling slowly past our tent, past our campfire, and all the way down the narrow dirt path that led straight to the lakeshore. There was no exit down there, no continuation of the road. It was a dead end. We both stood still, facing the direction they had gone. The vehicle sat down at the edge of the lake, just idling. No doors opened, no lights turned off. They didn't roll down the windows or flash their brights. They just sat there, facing the water. Minutes passed, maybe 5, maybe a little more. I looked over at my husband, who still hadn't moved from where he'd stood up to wave. Something in his stance had changed. He was tense, still holding the flashlight in one hand even though it wasn't on yet. Eventually, the SUV reversed slowly, turned around, and drove right back past us the same way it came in. No pause, no wave, just drove off the site and back up the gravel road. As soon as the tail lights disappeared into the trees, my husband told me to start packing everything up. No hesitation in his voice. He wasn't panicked, but he wasn't wasting time either. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. There was something wrong. Something about the way that vehicle acted didn't sit right. We had camped all over the West, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, and we'd met a lot of random strangers at backcountry sites, but no one had ever just silently rolled through our spot and stared at the water for 5 minutes in a place with no reason to stop unless you meant to be there. I started throwing gear into the back of the SUV, cooler, chairs, sleeping bags. My husband turned on the high-lumen flashlight and started scanning the beach. The vehicle hadn't driven into the waterline, just up to the edge of it. Still, he kept pointing the light back and forth like he was looking for something or someone. At some point, we both had the same thought. What if they dropped someone off? There was nowhere to walk to from where we were. The site was surrounded on 2 sides by the lake and on the other by brush and rocky ridges. But a person could easily step out, crouch in the brush, and wait for us to go to sleep. That's how isolated we were. By the time we had everything in the SUV, the sun was completely down. The only light we had was from our flashlights and the car's interior dome. We slammed the hatch shut, climbed in, and started the engine. Gravel crunched as we pulled away, back onto the bumpy path that had brought us in. It was the only way out. We didn't even make it half a mile before the same black SUV came around the bend ahead of us and pulled onto the road behind us. At first, I thought maybe they were just going back to town. Maybe they'd made a wrong turn earlier, but they were driving too fast to be casual. No headlights dimmed, no attempt to slow down, just barreling forward on our tail. My husband floored it. It's hard to describe just how bad those roads are unless you've driven them. They look manageable from a distance, just dirt and rock, but they're full of hidden holes and deep ruts that'll destroy your suspension if you hit them wrong. There are no guardrails, no lights, And in some places, the edge drops straight off into ravines or shallow canyons. And the worst part is, deer and elk move freely through there at night. You hit one, it's game over. I gripped the handle on the passenger side door as we tore around corners. Dust was flying everywhere. The inside of the SUV rattled like it was coming apart. I kept looking behind us, and sure enough, those headlights were still there. Still close, not backing off. My husband didn't say anything until we hit a stretch of road that wound through a narrow canyon. A natural corridor of high stone walls, maybe half a mile long. It was the only part of the drive where the road dipped enough to mask us from view, and as soon as we were out of their line of sight, he took the turn hard and fast, flying into the canyon without hesitation. The tires fishtailed once, then gripped. We shot through that passage like our lives depended on it. Maybe they did. The canyon curved and twisted for a minute, then spat us back out onto another dirt stretch. We didn't see headlights behind us after that. No sign of them. My husband didn't slow down for a while, not until we saw the lights of that small town come into view again. A gas station, closed for the night, sat at the edge of the highway. We pulled into the lot and waited. Nothing. Whoever was following us had either turned off or given up. Or maybe they hadn't expected us to bolt in the first place. We didn't go back to the lake. We drove another hour that night, checked into a cheap motel off the interstate, and locked every bolt on the door. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about that vehicle, about the timing, about how specific it was. There were dozens of other sites near the main campground. If they were just looking for a place to sit by the water, why come to the one site half a mile out with no exit? The next morning, we talked it over during breakfast. We couldn't shake it. It hadn't felt like a coincidence. It felt like someone had chosen that site for a reason. Maybe they were watching to see who ended up there. Maybe they had scoped it out before and waited for someone isolated to arrive. And we were the perfect target. We called the ranger station later that day and reported what had happened, described the SUV, gave them the time and place. They took our statement but didn't offer much else. Said they'd send someone to check the area. I don't know if they did. We've been camping plenty of times since then, but never in a place that